on our first lecture on homosexuality and continuing in the same vein as I did with the previous lecture series on transgenderism. I'm going to talk about the occult and esoteric practices that are associated with homosexuality and often, the act most physically associated with homosexuality. So, in that regard, be aware of what type of lecture it is that you're about to watch. Okay, this is not a lecture for children. If you're under a certain age, you shouldn't be watching this. It's not something to show to your children. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We're going to talk once again about Manly P. Hall's work, and we're going to show basically that there's this occult / esoteric interpretation of the anatomy of a human being, and here he says the occult anatomy of man, and what certain practices the esoteric traditions might teach in regard to homosexual type behaviors. And so what we're going to see is an individual source may not give you a clear picture, so you have to go and look up some of the terms used and then see, okay, what is the definition of this term? And then you have to look at multiple sections of the book, and which I'm going to highlight and go through for you, which taken in their totality, it starts to become clear what actions we're actually looking at. Okay, so we'll look at this book first. Then we're going to link the symbology in this book to other works, specifically of the Kabbalah, which Manly P. Hall cites in the structures, and show that there's basically a lot of those individuals basically encourage and supply a cosmology for homosexuality in human beings. So it's something that they'll lament, Roman society and other societies for banning or eliminating or putting laws against sodomy and other homosexual practices, but yet their own cosmology provides an answer for it, namely that the wrong soul or a female soul can be in a male body or vice versa, is supplied by this Kabbalistic thinking. And then we'll see in practice, what are these sorts of esoteric traditions result in more contemporary periods? Well, they result in figures like Aleister Crowley, who studied all these esoteric traditions and is obsessed with inverting all of the existing social structures. That's all going to be in part 1. In part 2, we're going to look at the specific anatomy in question. So the Kundalini yoga people talk about a specific anatomical structure at the base of the spine. We will identify that structure and some potential effects associated with it and cross-index that with individuals that have been victimized in this way, and the fact that leads to things like has the potential to lead to things like dissociative states and increased suggestibility, which you might think of as ways of essentially reprogramming people. So all these things put together starts to paint a very dark picture. It starts to make things like the human trafficking take on another dimension, and what people are proposing, minor attracted persons and all these movements that just are disturbing. The fact that it even is allowed to be openly bandied about, that these people can't help it's just, I want to provide this context for you as to why you might be seeing what you're seeing in the culture, and the fact that these ideas are so old, just like we did with the transsexual stuff. And what you'll see is that many of these people are highly connected, which for anybody that's followed the Jeffrey Epstein stuff, once again, underage people, a lot of them male on male, but not exclusively, obviously. The majority of the news coverage is of females in this instance. But there's a reason why you're seeing what you're seeing in the culture. And it starts with the clandestine and the occult and works its way outward, because it wouldn't be accepted by society writ large any other way. So that's what we're going to look at. That's going to be our primer for the rest of the homosexual discussion. Namely, we'll be talking about things such as what are the outcomes for homosexual parenting, what do homosexual relationships, are they more stable than heterosexual ones? What are the health risks associated with homosexual behavior? And the sort of immutable charge that there is no way to alter somebody's homosexuality, which is something that's often discussed, or that people are born homosexual. And then, much like I ended with the transsexual stuff, and this one's even more obvious, but just how ubiquitous programming and conditioning people in modern times to be accepting of homosexuality has spanned decades of the entertainment industry, starting with subliminal imagery, then working up to sort of background stuff, then kind of turning it into a joke, then turning it into a social movement, gay marriage, and now what we're seeing today. All of it was supported by the entertainment industry every step of the way and executed in phased lockstep perfectly to get us to the point where we are now. That's what this section is going to cover. Then after this, we'll talk about race. So again, we're trying not to pull any punches here. We'll see at what point I have the stuff I upload is just going to go to the archive, because there's a few things that I know that even on the alternative media sites, there's just no way they're going to let you talk about. So just keep that in mind. With said, viewer discretion advised once again, and let's get started.
So we look at here Manly P. Hall's The Occult Anatomy of Man. And so this, again, we touched on Manly P. Hall in the Occult and Esoteric Origins of Transsexual lecture, which was the first epilogue lecture in the transsexual series. And so he also made this work, The Occult Anatomy of Man. So in it he says, in the scripture we are told God made man in his own image. It is so stated not only in the Christian Bible, but also in the holy writings of nearly all enlightened people. The Jewish patriarchs taught that the human body was the microcosm or little cosmos, made in the image of the macrocosm or great cosmos. This analogy between the finite and the infinite is said to be one of the keys by the aid of which the secrets of the Holy Writ are unlocked. What does that mean? That means that they're basically linking your body is like the universe, and in order to unlock the secrets of the universe, therefore, you have to unlock portions of your own body. There is no doubt the Old Testament is a physiological and anatomical textbook to those capable of reading it from a scientific viewpoint, which basically means you're going to provide like a second and third and fourth interpretation to what's already existing in the text as it is. So we already know that they're going to be, oh, well, this is really a metaphor for this thing, and if you look at a deeper level of this. And the thing is, to me, I get that there's, hidden symbolism and a lot of things that's intentional. But also, I mean, if you're just a schizophrenic in a room studying a piece of text and searching your own mind for any sort of connection, you can come up with a lot of bizarre stuff. So I don't want to lose sight of that. The functions of the human body, the attributes of the human mind, and the qualities of the human soul have been personified by the wise men of the ancient world, and a great drama has been built around their relationships to themselves and to each other. To the great Egyptian demigod Hermes, the human race owes its concept of law and analogy. The great Hermetic axiom was, that which is above alike unto that which is below, and that which is below unto like that which is above. Now, we touched on, again, in the same esoteric lecture stuff on transsexualism, we saw this Hermetic / Hermes stuff cited a lot, and it's sort of the root word for hermaphrodite. There's a reason that you see these things going together, the homosexuality stuff and the transsexual stuff, in the figure of rehabilitation. When the psychologist was working with the transsexual man to try and basically do conversion therapy, that dreaded horrible thing. And basically, he started conditioning him with more masculine behaviors, and what he noticed was that what was left after he got rid of the desire to be a woman was that he had homosexual desire still, and then he continued to work with him on that, and eventually the guy got a girlfriend and all those sorts of things. And all of that was in the rapid onset gender dysphoria, and it was the work of Barlow in which that was referenced. So if you're confused about what I'm referencing here, it will be linked in the description as well. The idea that these things aren't connected on any level is pretty silly, and they're often linked together too, except for when it's convenient for certain individuals. So the religions of the ancient world were based on nature worship, which in a degenerated form has survived to our own clay as phallicism. The worship of the parts of the function of the human body began late in the Lemurian period. During the Atlantean epoch, this religion gave place to sun worship. So blah, 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 blah. But he's basically saying there's a period where we were worshiping male anatomy. And so he talks about the Hermetic traditions of Greece and Egypt and India. And this is this sort of, I won't call it word salad, but it's this thing that you often see where people will find parallels for multiple different religions all over the world, and then they try to make this unifying sort of Unitarian link between them all. And if you're participating in this in some way, then you're on the right path, and there's so many paths to the right way, and blah, 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 blah. And which is interesting because any explicit readings of like the texts of the Christian text or the Muslim text, and they all have very explicit mechanisms by which you're supposed to behave, and some of them are mutually exclusive. So the idea that they're all coming from the same place to me is just silly. So he continues to link the Scandinavians with Midgard, and he talks about Masonic interpretations of some of this stuff. So you'll see Masonry reappear often. And so the spinal column is Jacob's ladder connecting heaven and earth, while the 33 degrees of Masonry and the number of years of the life of Christ. Up these segments, the candidate ascends in consciousness to reach the temple of initiation located at the top of the mountain. It is the domed room with the hole, the foramen magnum, and the great mystery initiations are given. So basically he's saying anatomically, if you look at the base of somebody's skull, there's a hole where the spinal cord goes up and connects with the brain, okay? And he's saying that region is where the spinal column with its 33 segments meet with the brain, and that's the seat of the initiation and blah, 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 blah. All this stuff which these people have convinced themselves of. And with the Hindus and the Ganges, the sacred river is the spinal canal. And then he tries to link all these ideas to the Quran. And then he goes on to describe anatomy in the following ways. The Trinity in man lives in the great chambers of the human body, the brain, the heart, and the reproductive system. These are the three main chambers of the pyramid, and also the rooms in which are given the entered apprentice, fellowcraft, and master mason's degrees of Blue Lodge Masonry. So think about this for a minute. The brain, the heart, and the reproductive system are the main chambers of the pyramid in the masonry degrees. So what does the reproductive system have to do with that? In the three chambers dwell the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and are symbolized with the word AUM. The transmutation, regeneration, and unfoldment of these great centers result in the sounding of the lost word, which is the great secret of the Masonic order. From the spinal nerves come impulses and life forces which make this possible. Therefore, the Mason is told to consider this his substitute word, which means the marrow of the bone. If you're starting to get creeped out by this, good. That means that you're paying attention. In the cerebellum or posterior part of the brain, which has charge of the motive system of the human body and is the only brain developed in the animal, is said to be a little tree-like growth, which has been symbolized by the sprig of acacia and as such referred to in the Masonic allegory. It's actually, the cerebellum is actually responsible for balance, and it's this, posterior underneath portion of the brain that's associated with a lot of like movement, and there's also connections to your inner ear and other sorts of things that are of relevance there. The brain is filled with vaulted chambers and passageways. The third ventricle is undoubtedly the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, and here's where we start to get into all the snake stuff. Remember when I showed you, once again, and it would be a good idea to go back and reference if you're lost on some of this stuff, which you should be. If you're normal, you should be lost on some of this stuff. If this stuff makes total and complete sense to you, then I would suggest that you get some help. But it would make sense to go back and view the first transsexual lecture where I linked the ideas of transsexualism and transgenderism to the occult and esoteric traditions, including Masonry and a lot of these traditions, which basically state that we came from these hermaphroditic perfect beings and all this goofy stuff. And one of the texts that said that was literally about serpent worshiping of snakes. And the spinal cord is the serpent of the ancients. In Central and South America, the savior god is called Quetzalcoatl. His name is the leathered serpent and has always been his symbol. This is the brazen serpent raised by Moses in the wilderness. The 9 rattles on the tail are called the number of man, and they represent the sacral and coccygeal bones within whose centers the secrets of human evolution is contained. If you're not familiar, when you talk about the coccygeal bones, that's the base of the tailbone that we're talking about. He references Osiris, the lord of the underworld, and he talks about the pineal gland and then these connections to African culture, and the pineal gland being the tail of the dragon, and the skull is the sanctum sanctorum of the Masonic temple, and all these sorts of things. And he links all these ideas together. I would say that there are people that are convinced of this. There's disagreements on this stuff. Normal people probably don't want anything to do with it. But my point being, and as we'll see with some upcoming figures here, the bizarre sorts of people that believe in these things somehow wind up in positions of power or interconnected with tons of people in positions of power. And despite, the trail of bizarre behavior, sometimes criminal behavior they leave behind, they're still able to just keep going. There's this weird thing where these people are sort of protected. To not observe this phenomenon and what the writings of these people are and what the writings of these people reference, a good case study to do on this would be, I don't know if I'll ever have time to do this, so I'm just going to mention it now, kind of out of left field. Looking at the figure of George Soros and his influence of Karl Popper, and he'll often, even in lectures on YouTube, he'll reference Karl Popper and other people like this. In order to reverse engineer some of the problems we're seeing in society, why not look at some of the key figures responsible and look at what sorts of belief systems that they adhere to and attack those ideas instead of just saying this person's bad, this person's wrong, because they spend all their time trying to reverse engineer and attack your ideas, and that's why they're so successful. I don't understand why you wouldn't consider this process. I'll just throw out the George Soros, Karl Popper thing, and hopefully you can think of your own examples. But now we come to the spinal column. It's at this point I'll once again remind you this is a conversation for adults. It's going to be increasingly, potentially alarming and uncomfortable for people, as it should be. I can tell you this is not a very pleasant thing to research. It's not very enjoyable. It's something that you should take significant amount of breaks from, and probably you only need to learn it once. So once you've, sort of watched this video and understand some of these concepts, I would recommend not dwelling on them. I would recommend not spending significant enough time with them. You'll remember enough to know where to recognize this language or where you've heard it before, and to run the opposite way if you encounter it, or if you see somebody exerting certain symbols that remind you of this stuff, it might cause you a reason to perk up your ears. But once again, not something I would spend a significant amount of time studying. The spinal column, connecting the two worlds. So just as we saw before, the above and below concept, heaven above and the sphere of darkness below is the spinal column, a chain of 33 segments protecting within them the spinal cord. This ladder of bones plays a very important part in religious symbolism of the ancients. It is often referred to as a winding road or stairway. Sometimes it is called the serpent, at other times the wand or scepter. The Hindus teach that there are 3 distinct canals or tubes in the spinal system. They call them the Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna. These tubes connect the lower generative centers of the body with the brain. So what did we talk about with the Freemasonry stuff? There's the brain, the heart, and the reproductive organs. And whenever he says generative, that's what he's talking about. He's basically saying the genitals, your reproductive passages, are connected to the brain through the spinal column. The Greeks symbolized them by the caduceus or wing staff of Hermes. This consisted of a long rod which ended in a knob or pole or ball, the pons of the medulla oblongata. Basically, he's saying in the Greek Hermetic tradition, which remember, the Hermes stuff is often associated with hermaphrodite stuff, so just keep that in mind. And he's saying that there's the symbolism of the rod in this case is essentially like the spinal column, and the knob at the end is basically the medulla oblongata, which is a region in the brain that's responsible for a lot of essential functions. And obviously one can think of the fact that he's using a rod with a knob on the end. So there's other associations that can be drawn there. Unfortunately, the ancient Hindus have a legend concerning the goddess of Kundalini. If that name rings a bell to you, think of Kundalini yoga, all this popularization of yoga all over the place. Again, if you enjoy, intense stretching and things like that, of that nature, or you enjoy, being in a sauna and doing intense stretching, I have no issue with that. But I would encourage people, if you're going to be a quote-unquote yoga practitioner, to actually understand the origins of the ideas that you're participating in. The goddess of Kundalini, in which it is said that she descended by means of a ladder or cord from heaven to a little island floating in the Great Sea. Connecting this with embryology, it is evident that the ladder or cord represents the umbilical cord, while the little island is the solar plexus. So the ladder is cut away from heaven, the goddess flees in terror to a cave, the sacral plexus, where she hides far from the sight of men. So they're basically saying in this mythology, this cord to heaven, that's your umbilical cord when you're a baby. And the umbilical cord goes into your body. It resides in your solar plexus. And then when the umbilical cord is cut, it goes into your sacral plexus. So the Kundalini goddess is existing inside of your pelvis, where your reproductive organ. Like the Amaterasu, Japanese goddess of the shining face, she must be lured from her cave, for while she is there and refuses to come out, the world is in darkness. Kundalini, in a Sanskrit word meaning a serpentine or twisting gas or force. This force, so the Eastern sages claim, can be drawn up through the central spinal canal, the Sushumna. Obviously, we're starting to circle over the drain here about getting closer to what it is that we're actually talking about. We're going to connect these traditions where it supposedly is emerging in your pelvis, and you need to draw this energy, this essence, up through your central spinal canal from your sacral plexus. Your central spinal canal from your sacral plexus. How are you going to get there? How are you going to get from the central spinal canal through your sacral plexus? And when this essence strikes the brain, it pens the center of spiritual consciousness and inner perception, bringing with it spiritual illumination. The system of culture whereby this is made possible is the most secret teaching of the Eastern saints. For they realize that this spiral twisting force is not only illuminating, but like the serpent which it is symboled, it is also a deadly poison. You have this potential to enlighten yourself by bringing this energy from your pelvis into your spine, and it travels up to your brain so you can become enlightened. But if you execute it incorrectly, it can be a quote-unquote deadly poison. Smatterings of Eastern occultism come to the Western world from time to time, but we are sorry to say they bring with them endless suffering and sorrow, for these great truths in the hands of individuals incapable of rightly understanding or applying them destroy intelligence and reason, which is, I mean, you think about it, okay, why would you, with all this negative side, why would you evoke this symbolism to suggestible people? Although along the spine are a number of nerve and ganglia plexus. All of these have their place in religious symbolism. For example, we are told the early Jews called the sacral plexus and the sacrococcygeal ganglion the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. What is the term sodomy named after? It's named after the city of Sodom. What was the practice that was taken? Why was it called that? Because in the Old Testament, in the city of Sodom, they were known for the practice of sodomizing each other. They were engaged in homosexual relations with each other. And Gomorrah was another city that, if you've read the Old Testament, basically God wipes these cities out, and he tells Lot, who is related to Abraham, again, for those that are not familiar with his story, essentially he tells Abraham, hey, if there's enough righteous people in these cities, I'll spare them. And of course there aren't. So there's a warning that takes place to get Lot out of the city, and Lot takes his family after one of the most horrific things that happens in the entire Old Testament happens in that section. And his wife looks back and turns into a pillar of salt, and the cities are completely destroyed. If they're referring to this sacrococcygeal ganglion in this way, we know what this is a reference to. Okay, it's a reference to sodomy. It's a reference to anal penetration. There's a small plexus in the region of the kidneys called the sagittal plexus, which the ancients knew as the city of Tarsus, where St. Paul fought with the beast. Higher up occultism teaches that lotus blossoms, nerve centers on the spine, are reflections or negative poles bearing witness of 7 great positive centers of consciousness located in the brain. The nerves running along the spine, which we've already likened to serpents, correlate to positive centers of consciousness located in the brain. These 7 function through the center on the spine in approximately the same way that the 7 spirits before the throne function through the planetary bodies. The wanderings of the children of Israel in the wilderness, the pilgrimage of the Mohadim to Mecca, and endless pilgrimage of Hindu holy men who spend their lives going from one shrine to another represent the pilgrimage of the spirit fire, Kundalini, through the nerve centers along the spine. There's a recontextualization here where he's saying the same thing as the Old Testament quote-unquote Israelites going through the wilderness, is the same thing as the Muslims going to Mecca, is the same thing as Hindu holy men, and it's represented by the spirit fire through the nerve centers along the spine. So what is he talking about? You're replicating anatomically those journeys of significance by stimulating the Kundalini, which we've already identified as inside the pelvis, along the spine. By certain specifications, force is turned into these centers one after the other one until, when seen clairvoyantly, they are great flower-like areas from the light rays stream like petals. Each of the lotus blossoms has different petals according to the number of nerves branches out from it. There's this lotus blossom imagery that you're seeing, and you often see this associated with yoga-like practices and things of that nature. And he's basically saying, as these nerves along the spine are stimulated, since you basically see great lights, and the way that these lights or lotus blossoms look is in accord with the number of nerves that are branching out from this system. It is said the Logos, when the time came to create the material universe, so they're talking about basically the consciousness of a creative entity, entered a state of deep meditation, centralizing his thought power upon 7 flower-like centers of the 7 worlds. Gradually his life force descended from the brain, which was the great superior world, and striking these flowers one after another, wave birth to the lower worlds, which at last his spirit fire struck the lowest center of the physical world was created, and his fire was at the base of the spine.
So through like these creative energies or whatever else, through all this, potentiality is placed, it's sitting at the base of the spine, just waiting to be accessed. When the world returns to him again and he once more becomes supreme in consciousness, it will be because he withdraws the life from the seven centers, beginning with the lowest, and returns it again to the brain. Thus, the path of evolution for all living things is to raise this fire, whose descent made their manifestation in the lower worlds possible, and who raising brings them into harmony once more with the superior worlds. By bringing this energy from the base of your spine to your brain, you're reaching an ascended state, supposedly. We've already identified the Kundalini as being in the pelvis and all this sorts of stuff. The myth of the life force came down and took upon itself worlds, and he basically says, this is the Hiram Abiff who built the Masonic temples and was slain by the three vehicles. This was likewise the Christ slain for the sins of the world. So he's linkaging basically all these figures together and trying to connect them to this lineage. I would say I don't know how you exactly can do that without making some massive logical leaps. Because of the fact that this spinal fire is a twisting serpentine force, the snake has been used in all parts of the world to represent the world's saviors. I don't know if you like snakes. I don't like snakes. And I don't really particularly trust people that really like snakes either. So this saviors of the world thing is kind of interesting to me. The urachus worn by the Egyptian priests was symbolic of Kundalini, the sacred cobra who, when she was raised in the wilderness, saved all who gazed upon her. Moses and the brazen serpent. There is no reference in the Old Testament that, ascribes all this additional stuff to the snake in that story. As the brain is the center of the divine world, so the solar plexus is the center of the human world for representing semi-consciousness. It links the unconscious below with the conscious above. Man is not only capable of thinking with his brain, he's capable of certain phases of thought through the nerves at the center of the solar plexus. Just for reference here, the solar plexus is sort of an outdated term, but basically you're talking about a ganglion or bundle of nerves, and ganglion just means it's a collection of nucleuses, which is like the control center of nerves that pass each other at the central location in the abdomen. And it's an outdated term, but as you can see here, it's associated with all these sort of yogic practices. So you can see here is represented what he's talking about, and sort of address, anatomically that term a little bit. A clairvoyant is one who has raised the spinal serpent into the brain and by his growth earned the right of perceiving the invisible worlds with the aid of the third eye or pineal gland. Someone that has raised the quote-unquote Kundalini energy from the base of their spine all the way up to their brain, the third eye, is associated with the pineal gland, the organ of consciousness which millions of years ago connected man with the invisible worlds, closed during the Lemurian period when the objective senses began to develop. The occultist, however, by process of development hinted at before, may reopen this eye. So the occultist, by the process of development hinted at before, so all of the stuff he described previously as it relates to those energies coming from the sacral plexus, or coming from the spine into the sacral plexus into the brain, by that process, you may reopen this eye and explore invisible world. Clairvoyants are not born, they are made. Mediums are not made, they are born. The clairvoyant can become such only after years, sometimes lives of self-preparation. The medium, by sitting in a darkened room, may secure results in a few days. So basically he's saying there's people that work at this stuff, and then there's people that just have a natural gift to see these things. But if you're not concerned by this, you're not paying close enough attention. The medium uses the solar plexus as a mirror, and upon its sensitive nerves are reflected pictures recorded in invisible ethers. So he talks about the spleen, intelligence. He says the medium permits decarnate intelligences to come into his spiritual constitution, the result being voices and other spiritual manifestation. So he's talking about possession here. Decarnate intelligences come into his spiritual constitution, and the result is that you get voices and other spiritual manifestations. Do you see why I'm not the biggest fan of the psychedelic stuff that's being pushed so much, when these same sorts of practices are tied to those ideas as well, where it's about letting something take over you? Again, if you're an atheist, just think of this as an esoteric manual to induce things like schizophrenia, okay? I'm not saying that you can or should believe in any of this stuff. It's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's people that are. There's people that have practiced this for a long time, and for whatever reason, it's interconnected with a variety of ancient religions traditions, which if you're an atheist, maybe that solidifies your hatred of religion. Fine. And that for whatever reason, these people keep winding up in powerful interconnected circles. We kind of touched on Manly P. Hall previously. He's given all these academic positions, and he's in all these like wealthy circles and stuff. So the same guy that's writing all this stuff is very interconnected into powerful groups. Bears worth pointing out when you see bizarre practices of the elite, a la Epstein Island type stuff, and you see a long-standing tradition of a interest in the occult in the elite, and then you look at their writings and you kind of pair the things together. It's you can still explore this stuff if you're an entirely atheistic person. You don't have to believe it, but to ignore that other people do is asinine. This is not possible until the medium removes his own etheric double from the arm, for two things cannot occupy the same place at the same time. The process of periodically separating the life forces from the physical arm is very dangerous, often resulting in power paralysis. So what is he talking about here? During this process, you need to give up your own conscious control, and it can be dangerous sometimes. You can be totally paralyzed by this. Dude, what? He says mediumship is unnatural, meaning you're just getting taken over by something. Clairvoyance is like a willing process to engage in this stuff. And so he says the clairvoyant is unfolding his mind by filling it with useful knowledge, while the first instruction given to the would-be medium is make your mind blank. So realistically, in this scenario, it's almost like he's saying you kind of have a choice. If you want to be a clairvoyant, you can sort of take control and power over these processes, but the mediums are just slaves to it. They just get their minds emptied out and taken over by this stuff. But if you practice it and you function as a clairvoyant, you can use it and your power. And remember, he said there are 100 mediums to one clairvoyant. So it's almost like the clairvoyants in this instance are the super class of individuals. They're the elite in this scenario. The reason mediumship to the solar plexus is a retrogression may be summed up as follows. The group spirits who control the destinies of the animal kingdom govern then charges through pictures thrown against the solar plexus, for the animal has no self-conscious mind. As a result, in thinking with his own brain, it thinks with the brain of the group spirits, to whom it is attached by invisible magnetic cords. So, again, we see this connection to magnetism and electromagnetic fields and all this kind of stuff. Much more loosely so, but we'll continue on. These cords convey their impression and photograph them upon a sympathetic nervous system. Having no will of its own, the animal is incapable of combating these urges and consequently obeys them implicitly. You basically have a result where the brain is taken over by lower impulses. Can't control the combating of these urges, and he likens this to being like an animal. Man governs himself through the cerebrospinal nervous system because he has developed individuality, and the sympathetic system no longer rules him. Opening himself up to impulses through the solar plexus, the medium is thwarting his own growth by preventing cerebrospinal nervous system from controlling his destiny. So, and he'll go on to state this later. Basically, he's saying it starts at the base of the spine in the exact region that you're thinking of. And we'll actually look at the anatomical structure that they're talking about here, which is creepy. But there's an incompleteness if it stops in the solar plexus, if it stays in the gut, essentially, where we saw that ganglion in the center of the stomach. So how is the clairvoyant doing it? Well, they unlock a bunch of gates all the way up the spine till it reaches the pineal gland. So that's, the main difference. We're going to, for the mediums or the slaves, my terminology, not his, but sorry, I'm just going to impose my own influence here. By subjecting them to, let's say, a process in which the kundalini is stimulated and you're getting all these bright flashes and petals and whatever else, it's activating this nerve plexus, but it stays in the quote-unquote solar plexus. You could almost think of it like because they're not ascended to the same level, but it doesn't go all the way up to the pineal gland and open the third eye. You're creating a bunch of slaves, essentially. So the difference, therefore, between mediumship and clairvoyance is about half the length of the spinal column. So just in case you thought I was making that up, he's being explicit here. It is the difference between negative and positive, is the difference between the midnight of the seance room and noonday of the temple. So he's saying it gets activated, but it doesn't make its way all the way up to the brain, about half the length of the spinal column. The close relationship between the generative system, meaning the reproductive system, below the brain, above, for the brain is a positive generating system, is of course due to the spine connecting them. At a certain time, a number of little doors must now separate the brain from the generative system are opened, and the sushumna becomes an open tunnel so that every impulse is immediately carried to both ends of the body. So what is that going to do? Think about that for a minute, just practically here. We're going to open all the gates locking between your generative system, which basically means your genitals and your anus, and your brain, so that it's carried immediately. How does that get you further away from animalistic control if your genitals or brain are so directly connected that signals are going directly from one to the other? Wouldn't you want inhibition? Wouldn't you want suppression of reproductive impulses in your own best interest? Wouldn't you want to use the power of your cerebral cortex to potentially inhibit, and let's just be explicit here, sexual behavior, because that's the organs that we're talking about here? The candidate assumes vows of celibacy for the close connection existing in the brain. Disciple between the brain and the reproductive system necessitates an absolute conservation of all life energies. The tonsils are directly connected with the generative systems. It actually says something interesting. He says we should reconsider vaccinating healthy kids and stop giving them so much sugar, which, hey, that's interesting to put in there. Man is gradually gaining control not only over the organs of his body, but also other functions. Science states that certain organs function automatically or mechanically. Occultism teaches there is an entire universe within the human body, that it has its worlds, its planes, its gods, and its goddesses. Millions of minute cells are its inhabitants. These tiny creatures are grouped together in kingdoms, nations, and races. So you're a universe contained within yourself. At the base of the spine is located the throne of the Lord of the form commonly called Jehovah and Shiva. The linga is his symbol, which basically he's referring to male genitalia there. He rides the great bull of earthiness. His daughter is death and destruction, yet he is not a thing of evil. He builds the bodies which give us the power to function in the lower worlds. So, what are we talking about here? There's the throne of the Lord is at the base of the spine, and it's either Shiva, which is often associated with being the god of destruction, and Jehovah, which is often associated with being the Jewish god. To the occultists, birth is death and death is awakening. The generative system is gradually being absorbed into the brain and the man of the next great world period will generate its progenies, or at least form vehicles of them, through the larynx, which is the organ of the spoken word. So he's basically saying we will reach a point where we'll be able to, instead of through reproductive means, we'll be able to speak things into existence. He also references Vishnu and embryonic development, but you again at this point you sort of get the idea of what we're dealing with here. So you will commonly see this diagram, the occult anatomy here, and you'll see Adam Kadmon, we'll zoom in on this reference to the castle of Camelot and the temple of Solomon, and you see swastikas symbolized in the words for the sun and the moon, and you see representation for the male organs, the female organs, and once again the last vertebrae adjacent to the anus. Front and the bottom are neutral. Right and left side are neutral. The inferior is magnetic. So we're talking about this region here, and it's referenced as being Malkuth here. And if you zoom in closer, it gives names for the navel, the pubic bone, and the anus itself. And you can see the pillar of form, yin, feminine, positive, dark material, subjectivity, pillar of strength, column of mercy, yang, masculine, active, spiritual, objectivity, offensive. The middle pillar is the column of balance, and these pillars are often referred to as Yekin and Boaz, and they feature symbolically prominently in Freemasonry. So you can again see this lower quality image in the Occult Anatomy of Man, Manly P. Hall. And there's another diagram that you can see listed out with similar structures about the Occult Anatomy of Man. And just to make it clear that this is a part of contemporary yogic practice, the Mula Bandha, the root lock, which is associated with the anus in the diagram that we just saw, it accompanies both pranayama and meditation and provides continuity with breathing practices and meditation. The chief axis is the spinal column, which rises from the perineum to the base of the skull. Within this axis is said to be the central channel of energy. Two other passages of energy known as Ida and Pingala are described, twinning upward along the spine from its base to an end. And of course that's going to evoke the imagery of a serpent. Preliminary versions of Mula Bandha are suitable for all students and have beneficial effects for health as well as wellness. So just to make this clear, the pelvic girdle consists of three fused bones, the ilium, ischium, and pubis. The pelvis is open at the bottom, and at the base of that opening is an area called the perineum. The perineum is shaped like a diamond. The coccyx at the base of the spine lies at the rear of the diamond, while the front of the diamond is the pubic symphysis. The left and right corners of the diamond are two sit bones. Mula Bandha is associated with the center of the perineum. In Mula Bandha, the results from contraction of the muscles surrounding the perineal body, which lies midway between the anus and the genitals. Some texts suggest that by applying light pressure beneath this area, don't do this, by rolled sock, contraction can be stimulated. Postures in which pressure is applied by sitting on the heel of one foot have been described. For women, the contraction is said to be felt not at the perineal body, but the area around the base of the cervix. Attention might be to focus on the back, the front, and middle of the perineum, or on more than one area at a time. Now, they're referencing the perineum here, but we already saw in this diagram what is Mula Bandha referred to as. It's directly called the anus, okay, in the occult diagram here that we find in his book. So he's telling you to contract and relax those muscles, breathe freely, inhale and exhale. One translation characterized Bandha as a lock to a dam to the flow of energy, and another depicted it as a bridge to unite energies. As you do the practice described here, you may find contradictory meanings. It has effective restraining energy at the perineum. It's stabilizing and calming. A variety of benefits have been attributed to it. It has been detected that unstable menstrual periods can be regulated, blah, 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 blah. They're teaching you to contract and relax your anus is what they're doing. Specifically, let's look at the Kundalini gland. The Muladhara chakra is at the base of the spine, where Kundalini is supposed to lie coiled, awaiting to rise. Several factors led to the symbolic idea of a coiled serpent, for it appears that the energy is flowing backwards and forwards up the ladder of the spine from ganglia to ganglia. Again, we already saw this corroborated in Manly P. Hall. I experienced this during a hypnagogic vision during the time of my 1988 awakening. I imagine that energy is transmitted in this double helix fashion at the beginning of awakening prior to the inner conjunction through the Sushumna Nadi or central canal of the spine. So he invokes what? The same thing that the serpent stuff coiling up the spine invokes. Double coiled helix. Now, I don't know that I'll have time to touch on this or not, but it's very interesting if you go back and read Watson and Crick's original papers on DNA having this double helical structure, about what evidences they use to support that proposition. And there's a reason I've been critical of the DNA model. And if you look at it from the standpoint mapping the human genome and all this stuff, this was supposed to be $1 trillion making project. And you'll find that many, many people lost money investing in this human genome project because it didn't produce the results that you would think from mapping out the entire human genome. It just didn't wind up working that way. And so now you have all these piddly DNA tests to try and make some money back from all that stuff. But what that idea does centrally revolve around is this concept of a double helix that you will see mentioned in esoteric traditions and philosophy over and over and over again. There's a reason why I'm not so keen on just parroting the standard DNA narratives, but I don't know that I'll have time to get to that, so I'll just point that out so people can look up that for themselves. Although the traditions are focused on it, there's no such thing as ejaculating up the spine, but the nerve energy is perhaps turned to flow its power back through the nerves to the spine. This is done through the inner kinesthetic sensing, directing the eye of the mind and breathing. The redirection of nerve flow might be how the yogis prevent ejaculation while still having orgasm. It might feel as though there is ejaculation up the spine because of the Kundalini gland, or the coccygeal body at the base of the coccyx is composed of smooth muscle. It might appear he's ejaculating up his spine. I'd notice a sense of throbbing at the start of increasing Kundalini flow. The coccygeal body is an irregular oval-shaped gland between the rectal wall and the tip of the tailbone or coccyx. This is known as the Kundalini gland. One can often feel a pulsation in the sacrum. The coccygeal gland is fed by sympathetic adrenergic nerves from the first two gland and parasympathetic cholinergic nerves, and by the median sacral artery and vein, directly influencing the nervous system via chemical messages arising from the blood. It is several millimeters in diameter and is composite of epithelioid cells and smooth muscle cells. A study suggests it is possible blood-forming function and immune modulatory activity by regulation of the sympathetic nervous system through non-adrenergic control. Removal of the gland creates nervous derangement. Because it is a nexus of all the various body-mind systems, the Kundalini gland is key to homeostasis of the body and shifting metabolism over to the metamorphic state. Study could lead science to discover that the Kundalini awakening could be initiated or maintained by stimulation of the coccygeal body and the subsequent increase to the non-adrenergic mechanism of the sympathetic nervous system. If further studies confirm the possible involvement of the coccygeal body in the regulation of sexuality, this may explain the immunosuppressive status related to sexual repression as previously suggested by Wilhelm Reich. If you're going to take Wilhelm Reich's word for stuff, I have a problem with you. Yoga has devised a wide variety of techniques to initiate and awaken the gland into activity, including Mula Bandha, root locking, contracting perineum and lower abdomina, Asvini Mudra, contracting the pubococcygeus muscle of the perineum as a Kegel exercise, and Tada Mudra, knocking the buttocks upon the ground, sending rhythmic shock waves rippling up the spine, and rolling on a cotton ball placed under the tip of the tailbone, found in ecstasy through Tantra. So wait a minute. He's just said that, repression of sexuality, and maybe there could be a way to stimulate the coccygeal body, and we're going to do stuff like squeezing the glands or squeezing the muscles around it and slamming our backside into the ground to send a shock wave rippling up the spine. What else do you think that we're doing here? Come on. A study of anatomy defines the traditional idea of juices going up the spine. Nitric oxide and other neurotransmitters would be directly involved. The sex chemistry involved in interconjunction is many times greater than that which facilitates sex itself. Although the entire body is flooded with sex and growth hormones, during the peak in which spinal interconjunctions occur, and this serves to rev up metabolism, I still cannot see how sexual juices can enter the cerebral spinal fluid. Instead, I see the spinal fluid becoming supercharged with glutamate, calcium, and other ions, driving maximum nerve activity, even though it feels like a force of 10,000 orgasms is blasting directly up the spine. The fluid probably does a little faster during the interconjunction event due to increased electromagnetic field and increased cilia movement of tissue surrounding the CSF, hence the intense upward pressure. So circling back to the image that was used of the occult image of man, we looked at the base of the spine. We saw the term Malkuth. So what is Malkuth? It's the 10th Sephirot in the Kabbalistic tree of life. In the Zohar, an important Kabbalistic text, Malkuth sits at the bottom of the tree of life below Yesod and governs the simple fact of existence in the physical world. So remember, this is the same thing that the as above, so below type thing. This is where this comes from, along with all of the, Hindu tradition stuff. The central teaching of the Zohar coalesced around an anthropomorphic model in which the Sephirot represents a cosmic anthropos. Meaning, what's anthropomorphic mean? It means it takes the form of man. So the Zohar was the origin, this idea, although it's piecing together ideas from other traditions, from the concept that man's body is a model of the universe. Unlike the other 9 Sephirot, is an attribute of God, which does not emanate from God directly. Rather, it emanates from God's creation, when that creation reflects and evinces God's glory within himself. Malkuth means kingdom, is associated with the realm of matter and earth, and relates to the physical world. Some occultists have also likened Malkuth to cosmic filter, as it lies above the world of Quilpoth, or the tree of death. So remember, we saw that symbology there of the occultist has an understanding of life and death that's different. It is constructed from the imbalance of the original Sephirot in the tree of life. Malkuth is associated with the feet and the anus of the human body, the feet connecting the body to the earth, and the anus being the body's filter through which waste is excreted, just as Malkuth excretes unbalanced energy into Quilpoth. Another way to understand this is that when one is sitting, as in a meditative state, it is the anus that makes physical contact with the earth, whereas whenever one is standing or walking, it is the feet that come in contact with the earth. Malkuth is associated with the world of Asaya and the densest of the 4 worlds of Kabbalah. If this sounds like a Marvel movie theology or something, there's actually a reason for that, but we'll skip that for the time being. And Malkuth can also be related to the 4-page cards in tarot as well. There's also a connection between Malkuth and the 10th card in each suit in the tarot, as Malkuth is the 10th Sephiroth. In the modern set of playing cards is related to the suit of diamonds, symbolizing material wealth. It is directly associated with Asaya, Malkuth also represents the second he in the Tetragrammaton and is associated with the classical element of earth. The names of God associated with with Malkuth are Adonai Melka and Adonai Haaretz. The archangel of this sphere is Sandalphon. The Ishim, souls of fire, is the angelic order associated with Malkuth, and the planetary astronomical correspondence of Malkuth is the earth. Quilfath of Malkuth is represented by the demonic order Nehemoth, ruled by archdemon Nemah. Symbols associated with this sphere are a bride, a young woman on a throne with a veil over her face. That's the symbol of the spear ruled by demons, is a bride. And a double-cubed altar, where Benai is known as the superior mother. Malkuth is referred to as the inferior mother, is also referred to as bride of Microprospos, where the Macroprospos is Kether. From a Christian viewpoint, and this sphere is important, since Jesus preached that people should seek first the kingdom of God, it is equated that with da'at, knowledge, in the sense of gnosis, the invisible Sephirah. In comparison with Eastern systems, it's very similar to the archetypical idea of that Muladhara chakra in Chakra Tantra. So again, all these things coming together, which is associated with the earth, and it is a plane in which karma is expressed. Although Malkuth, as seen as the lowest Sephiroth of the Tree of Life, which we've just seen that it's been associated with feet and also the anus explicitly, it also contains the potential to reach the highest. Just like they said, oh, well, it starts there and then works its way up, the thing associated with the anus. This is exemplified in the Hermetic maxim, as above, so below, and Kether is in Malkuth, and Malkuth as in Kether. Just like we saw in the Manly P. Hall stuff. Now, we've already observed that in the Manly P. Hall portion at the very beginning of this lecture, there was this discussion about, higher order principles, and there's this occulted anatomy of man, and this special representation given to the base of the spine, and references to the Kabbalah and Malkuth. And then we looked up what that term means, and it's directly associated with the anus. And we saw the Kundalini yogic practices, which endorse stimulating this region in various specific ways. So we know these two ideas are linked. So, of course, then we look at, well, what about writings related to this practice, specifically related to sex differences in sexual behavior? And this is where you start to see a merging of the transsexual stuff we talked about in the previous series of lectures with potential homosexual practices, and the basis for both are established in this book. So let's continue on here. That reference in Manly P. Hall to the structures of the Sephiroth, and then we looked at them, including the idea of Malkuth being directly associated with the anus on this tree of the Sephiroth, right? And so here we have Sex of the Soul, the vicissitudes of sexual differences in Kabbalah, and this is 2005, so approximately 20 years old at this point. So there are a culmination of references in this book. So they're giving us some background on homosexual practices, okay, in various parts of antiquity. And they're also going to address writings that address this concept of homosexuality promoted by practitioners of Kabbalah. So there's not universal agreement. We're going to be skipping around to different sections of the book, but it's going to be clear that there's significant justification for homosexual and, in fact, even transsexual behaviors that have originated in Kabbalah. So we're going to be establishing some historical context stuff, laws against homosexuality. This person, the author of the book, often references homophobia. So the use of the term homophobia pretty liberally throughout this book is indicative of this person's slant. There aren't a lot of traditional conservative individuals that are using the concept of homophobia to slander a certain aspect of society or something like that. It's mostly individuals that are in support of homosexual causes and things like that that are using the term homophobia in a, slanderous degrading sort of way against their opponents. So just keep that in mind as we skip along through this text here. And they say the first law that prohibited homosexual acts was promulgated by Constantine II, made a very clear connection between this act and the confusion in sexual identity homosexuality was thought to produce. When a man acts in bed like a woman, what is he seeking? Sexuality loses all meaning. This is a crime which is better not to discuss. Venus has been perverted. One looks for love and does not find it. We hence command the law to rise up with its sword in hand and strike the individual who is guilty of such a crime, that this man be subjected to exquisite and subtle punishment. And so he goes on to say the fear of losing sexual meaning or sexual identity, or more precisely gender identity. So this is 2005, and in reference to Kabbalistic scholarship, we're talking about gender identity, helped to make homosexuality a crime punishable by the death penalty in the West. This idea of gender identity, once again linked to homosexuality, these things have kind of always been linked, and as we'll see in Kabbalah, they're explicitly linked. And it's sort of this natural progression that had to take place from, you had to get people on board with the idea of homosexuality, then homosexual marriage, and once that was in place, then you can take them to the next step, which is transsexuality. So of course we're reverse engineering the steps, and is doubtless based on deep-seated motivations which beyond the scope of this book to analyze. This fear should not be misconstrued in the remote past. I begin with a simple observation. There's growing contemporary concern over sexual identity and gender, attested to in broad converging evidence. Biology, sociology, and anthropology are frequently asked to come up with solutions to this modern torment, which is much more than a passing fashion. Why is this the case? Well, because Harry Benjamin, Magnus Hirschfeld, and Sigmund Freud foisted it on us. It wasn't as though this was a widespread problem that was struggling with the greater structure of Western society without these figures pumping it into the zeitgeist. And so just to get a conception of this individual author's idea, he describes that Roman edict as being virulent, inequality of sexualities across the whole gamut. This type of discourse emphasizes gender differences and relegates the homosexual relationship to a lower rank, coming from the left as well as from the right. This intellectual homophobia speaks in the name of culture and symbolic order and recycles, when needed, Lacanian psychoanalysis and anthropology. What is he saying? He's saying this idea that gender confusion is going to cause problems is essentially a pseudo-intellectual exercise designed to relegate homosexuality to a lower status. At no point in this discourse, and calling it a pseudo-intellectual problem, again, this is in his footnotes here, does he reference the fact that it can't produce children, which is necessary for the functioning of society. And you think about it, if people abandon heterosexual relationships writ large, okay, and you fall below birth replacement rates, that's a very reasonable issue. And the thing about homosexual relationships is because they cannot produce children, you can engage in them repeatedly, excessively, to whatever extent you desire without any potential repercussions of a generative act, right? Two women can engage with two women as much as they want in whatever activities they want. They're not going to wind up being responsible for a child. Two men can generate in whatever activities that they want. They're also not going to be responsible for a child. So again, not everybody should have children. But to act like there's no potentiality for this to have any consequences whatsoever, when particularly during that time period, things like succession, the strength of your country, your nation, et cetera, is so dependent upon maintaining your population, the idea that this couldn't become a problem where people could essentially get sex without the risk of producing children, yeah, they're going to care about this. And so this is intellectual homophobia with psychoanalytical and legal based on a fear of disappearance of masculine and feminine differences. So they're saying essentially, well, they're so worried if you jump into this homosexuality, the gender roles are going to dissipate and you're going to lose masculine and feminine differences. And what are we seeing right now, though? Acting like we shouldn't on any level be concerned about this is pretty silly. The sexual conduct of social actors tends to be cast into defined identities, heterosexual, homosexual, or identities in process of social definition, bisexuality, and these call for a reassessment of familiar definitions of functions, roles, and status involved in assigning gender. So he's saying, well, you have these gender constructs, and we need to constantly reevaluate these and restructure them. And the question I would have for you is why? Why is this such an essential need for the Kabbalist to continually redefine gender when you have a structure in which there's defined gender roles and you don't necessarily know what the consequences are of constantly trying to redefine them? What aspect of this is so essential for you that you need to deconstruct it so aggressively? The concepts of masculinity and femininity are constantly being revisited and reinvested with new values because there's revolutionaries in positions of power constantly doing this. Is this an intrinsic desire of the average human being to take place when there's only a tiny minority of individuals that identified as homosexual and identified as transsexual for a long period of time but has recently exploded? So why were this is 2005, why are we referencing their outsized voice? And a lot of these references are far older. Individualism tends to transform male and female genders as they have long been defined into individual variables with each and every person may define as he or she pleases. So in other words, they can be as selfish as they want to. I'm just saying, if you make your society all about the individual, then again, regardless of gender stuff, how effective is your society going to be? The relative lack of flexibility of the old frameworks, from classical episteme to religious commandments, and even to a certain extent concepts in psychoanalysis, conflict with the contemporary demand for flexibility and adaptability. Again, I would position you and ask, where is all this flexibility and adaptability coming from? Again, quoting Lasser here in his footnotes, the homosexual loves the other because he is other himself. There's often psychic denial of gender difference at adolescence. What poses the question for the child is that his parents' uncautious discourse may be that of the negation of the opposite sex. The child can always find identification outside of the family setting. In certain homosexual couples, this is possible, but unfortunately not in all. So he's basically, we know that this is a pro-homosexual position he's arguing for, and he's basically saying homosexuality is symptomatic of some proto-gender dysphoria. They're arguing for a similar thing here, wanting to be in a more submissive posture, or potentially wanting to get out of a lot of the responsibilities associated with being a man, or potentially if you're a woman, there's responsibilities associated with being a woman. One is born boy or girl, and being one or the other is never an issue. Nowhere in the Hebrew Bible, so they're criticizing, the text of the Hebrew Bible, which is fine. You can do that as much as you want to, okay? But they're retroactively going back and looking at a large part of what Western civilization was influenced by, okay? So again, they're trying to restructure things. Nowhere is the question, who is a girl or who is a boy raised, since the answer seems so obvious that it requires no explanation. Yes, and it's functioned that way for a very long period of time, pretty successfully. So if you're going to tinker with this, you have to provide some justification as to what benefit that you're going to observe in your entire society before you just decide it's a necessity to invert, alter, or change gender roles. Once identity has been established on a purely visual external basis, no change is accepted or even acknowledged as possible. So in a John C. Lilly context, what do these people have to do? They have to engender the idea into the minds of everyone in civilization that it in fact is possible to change your gender. That's the first step, providing people with the idea. And that's what they're going about doing. Well, nobody's even bothered asking. Nobody's even thinking to ask because it's so obvious. So our role is to force on people the idea that it can be changed. And having looked at transsexuality over the course of many hours at this point, over a dozen lectures, we've seen, even with modern technology, the outcomes are bad. With the benefit of hindsight, why are we continuing to pursue this? Parents or individuals in attendance at the birth of a baby, such as midwives, must make no mistake on this point. The infant's fate is sealed and social status is determined. The angels or the prophetic oracles always announce the birth of boys. And so he goes on to basically make this argument about male domination, and men's domination of women would be immediately problematic and might be perceived as unfounded or poorly founded if these gender concepts were to be inverted. Do you see where we're headed with this? So if you can disrupt gender identity, alter gender roles, then you can easily make the argument that, male control over society is unfounded, wrong, abusive, etc., etc. And so the Kabbalists were positioning this a long time ago. This would open the door for all sorts of challenges on the power of one gender over the other. The rigor of gender differentiation in classic Judaism is only a special case of a broader concern with discrimination and differentiation between the self and non-self, a classification between pure and impure species. The masculine component of the woman and the feminine component in the man are like the traces of existence of the opposite sex in the depths of their consciousness, awakening their desire toward the other and stimulating their fecundity. It is clear Kabbalists were unable to accept that feminine desire could be masculine and vice versa. They had to construct a complex system interweaving and intertwining between the sexes, just like the snake going up the spine, in each individual to justify heterosexual desire. So he's saying, wait a minute, the Kabbalists had to tie themselves into knots to justify heterosexual desire, which, as we will see, is at least as problematic and difficult to understand as homosexual desire, often considered by public opinion as a mysterious anomaly. So what are we arguing for here? We're arguing that homosexual desire is more natural and more intrinsic than heterosexual desire. The heirs of ancient esoteric Judaism, but Neoplatonism as well, it was easier to provide a theoretical explanation for the desire for the same sex than for the opposite sex. One significant attempt for the explanation can be found in Polish Kabbalists of the 16th century, Mordecai Yaffe. He states that unlike the desire for the opposite sex, the desires for one's own sex exclusively comes from the natural soul and does not come from the aspiration of souls to reunite to form the whole individual, simultaneously male and female, which existed before birth, according to the view which the Zohar integrated from the Platonist myth of androgyny. Exactly what we saw in Freemasonry. Exactly what we saw in the serpent worship. Exactly what we saw in Manly P. Hall's reference in the Secret Teaching of All Ages in the first transsexual lecture that I showed you. Homosexual desire is hence strictly natural, whereas heterosexual desire is supernal and deploys on the level of the spiritual soul. The insufficiency of homosexual desire does not lie in the fact that it is unnatural, since it arises from natural logic at its most obvious, but rather the fact that it is not motivated by a longing for primordial unity of the androgynous soul before coming into this world. So they're basically saying it's more normal for homosexual desire. However, to reach a certain level of attainment, the representation of heterosexual desire comes from trying to unite with this androgyne thing. So it's almost as if there's this progression from the natural state of homosexuality to this hermaphroditic thing that we're talking about, the androgyne, which is the ultimate sort of figure. This explanation shows to what extent the Kabbalist mode of reasoning contrasts with philosophical religious discourse of medievals and moderns, and let it be said, our contemporaries. For other Jewish authors in the 16th century, man's love for a friend of the same sex was frequently placed higher than love for a woman, which at its best would lead to the formation of a single flesh according to Genesis, whereas the former, considered to be completely disinterested, could achieve the unity of two souls as stated in the story of love of Jonathan for David in 1 Samuel. The representation in this portion of the Old Testament that he's referencing here, there's nothing about a strict reading of the text that would suggest that their relationship is homosexual. And again, you have terms for things like brotherly love that would account for this. And he says discrepancies between anatomical gender and gender of the soul in Lurianic Kabbalah. A woman contains sparks from another female soul. She gives birth to a girl. The girl's body can be the recipient of a female soul. And in this case, one can speak of full incarnation of a female soul. Sometimes a man is reincarnated in a woman's body because of a certain sin, such as homosexual sex and the like. And this woman, which is a reincarnation of man, cannot conceive and become pregnant because she does not have female waters to rise up and receive a drop of the male waters. So there's this contrast between, different aspects of the teaching that seem to either condone or not condone homosexual behavior, depending on the level of esotericism involved in your reading of the text. So at the base level, individuals with a lower level of understanding might read some of these texts and come to the understanding that it's disapproving of homosexual behavior. But at a higher level, people that have had their pineal gland opened or what have you, they're going to understand the true nature and the true way to deploy this stuff. And in these contexts, they're associating things like the wrong soul being put in the opposite sex body. And we see a sort of proto-transgenderism once again associated with this concept. And he references this idea of the Lurianic interpretation of homosexual intercourse from a source that I can't even find searching even the name of when looking for it. Just to establish here, we have a fleshing out of these ideas across these ancient texts associated with these esoteric traditions and literally anatomical structures that have been defined here. We see again, Abraham ben David makes it explicitly clear the relationship between the divine androgyny and the sum of the divine attributes, which is also equivalent to the unity of the two prime names. So you see this sort of, attempt at divinity taking place here by combining with this androgynous figure. Again, another reference to Mordecai Yaffe writing that desire for one's own gender is exclusively coming from the natural soul. You see a reference to the explanation of the prohibition of adultery as a type of homosexual relationship. And here we come to the discussion. So we already referenced Malkut, and we saw what region of the body that was associated with. Two Sephirot, Tiferet and Malkut, are considered to be containing in themselves the totality of the Sephirot. The couple formed by them encompasses the rest of the Sephirot, as if the latter were only parts within the whole comprising the two poles. So we know what end of the pole the Malkut is on, right? The base of the spine. One of them corresponding to the masculine partner of the human couple, the other the feminine partner. The reunion of each, and they say that the Tiferet is for the male and the Malkut for the female. Well, we know what the Malkut's representative of in the Wikipedia article that we just looked at, the anus. So for the female, it's arguing for a receptive role. The reunion of each particular organ with its homologue in the partner's body during union theurgically assures the reunion of their superior parallels. The conjugal relation follows a progression of which the union becomes more and more complete and close correspondent with the hierarchy of the union but between the diverse divine members composing the Sephirot, the Tiferet, and the Malkut. The body of the man and that of the woman are explicitly considered to be like Shur Qomah, an ancient expressive deriving from the mysticism of the Helkalot or palaces. So again, we've seen palace stuff associated with different regions of the human body as well, where it is designated the measure of the stature of the divine body. If man was created in the image of God, he must be a dual entity like God. The female comes from the man the same way wisdom extends outside God. The woman is no less human than man, just as wisdom is no less divine than God. Man, who is located at the lowest level of beings, nevertheless influences all the levels of the divine world, and in particular affects the Sephirot, Yesod, which is representative of the male organ, by the way, and Malkut, which we said associated with the feminine, but we also saw was associated with the anus, where the masculine and feminine principles are most fully expressed and are the equivalent functions of giving and receiving. The triggering of the act of giving and receiving connects these two Sephirot, and their functional interaction corresponds to their structural unification. What are we talking about here when we're linking these two things? It should be pretty clear at this point. If this is representative of the male reproductive organ, and we've seen explicitly stated in Wikipedia, this is representative of the anus or female receptivity, and this is masculine and feminine principles being fully expressed, and these two things need to be united to connect the other 10 Sephirot. What are we looking at here? So it's why they've intentionally used all this outside language, and I'm not saying every single person that is into this stuff comes to the same interpretation here. But once we finish this discussion, finish the discussion after this one, we'll start tying these pieces together and make it more explicit in the actions certain people conduct. But when looking at these ideas and this information, and the fact that we see this gender confusion stuff originating out of this, the fact that we see this stating of homosexual desire being more natural than heterosexual desire, and we see the same sorts of terminology used by Manly P. Hall to try and activate the pineal gland and working up the spine and all this kind of stuff, and it corresponds with the same language we're seeing here with these two areas of the Sephirot needing to be unified in order to have completeness and all these sorts of things. What sorts of physical acts do you think this is going to result in?
And coming on a contemporary work of Kabbalah, here we have the chapter on homosexuality. Kabbalah is a blueprint, a technology based on the energy of life. It allows us to have more light in our lives and strengthen our connection to that 99% reality from which we all derive. It explains the ultimate purpose to life is to transform our selfish desires and learn to share with people. Everyone, gay or not, faces the tough task of learning to resist the overwhelming selfish behavior the adversary proposes. When speaking with my gay students, I find that they easily connect to the idea of male and female energy. What terminology are we using? The same stuff that we used in all those previous esoteric traditions with all those hermaphrodite type ideas in the transsexual lecture. These are the positive and the negative charges that exist in the unified soul. Again, if you think about the original concept of this idea where you have male and female both in the same body, and then it gets split and all this kind of goofy stuff that we talked about in the esoteric transsexual lecture. Well, explains that male and female energies or male and female souls can be drawn into a body of the opposite sex. So he's literally just said that this belief system generates the exact same idea as the transsexual idea. So Kabbalah is one of the originators, progenitors of all this transsexual stuff. People can even have a combination of both these energies, which can affect their sexuality. To learn to be more sharing, to become like the light, and to ignite the law of attraction in our lives. So whatever combination of soul and body we may have, we are all exactly who we need to be in order to accomplish this mission. Kabbalah explains that wherever the fantastic voyage may take us, we are all sparks of the divine, of the Creator, and the Creator does not make mistakes. Treating all people with dignity is an essential element of Kabbalah, not only because it is morally correct, because judgment and hatred are tools of our adversary, and they immediately disconnected from the light. So light in this context he uses as a noun. It is important that we all understand the concept in male and female as they're defined Kabbalistically. Male and female do not necessarily refer to a physical male and female body. Kabbalah deals with forces of energy that have nothing to do with materiality. There's a male energy and a female energy, and these two particular forces can be found in either a man's or a woman's body in varying proportion. In gay relationships, it is not unusual to find that one partner expresses more female qualities and the other more male ones. So again, this sort of progression of ideas that Harry Benjamin kicked us off with in the transsexual lecture, this idea that you have male/female bodies, he's explicitly linking here with homosexuality as well. So again, these ideas are interlinked. He talks about Rachel, who is constantly filled with fear of rejection, and she's gay. Studying Kabbalah helped me realize that it isn't about whether you're gay or straight. It's about understanding that every single person has something to contribute to life. This has nothing to do with the topic at hand. We are all responsible for the amount of negativity or light in the world. That sure sounds nice, doesn't it? But here's the problem with that. If you have powerful entities and you have powerful organizations and belief systems that are pushing for certain agendas, if all you're trying to do is not bring negativity and you're not disconnecting from the light, you're pretty easy to just roll over. Do you see what I'm saying? And given the fact that these individuals are all being taught, and in the Manly P. Hall concept, these, Kabbalah practitioners or whatever, how they're being trained and stuff, how do we know that they're not just being awakened to a level that will necessarily just make them easier to control? After all, there's only 1 to the 100 that Manly P. Hall identified, that the energy travels all the way from the pelvis to the pineal gland, right? So most of these people aren't going to reach that top precipice. Suppose we have a gay couple that shares a life distinguished by constant striving to be kind toward others. They make an effort to treat people with human dignity. And he says, what about a heterosexual couple that treats each other abusively? Which couple, according to the teachings of the Kabbalah, reveals greater light to the world? Answer, no surprise here, it's the gay couple. Kabbalah basically providing a tacit endorsement because it's advocating for the transmutation of gendered souls into bodies independent of their outward expression. And so that also means that it's appealing to the concept that you can basically alter reality. And I find it very problematic when I encounter individuals that think through their own internal cognitive processes that they can change reality. This becomes a problem. Okay, so we've explicitly linked occult anatomy of man with specific belief systems, and those specific the writings of authors on those specific belief systems turn out to be, at the very least, basically pro-homosexual, because they have created an entire cosmology, essentially, to explain homosexual desire and also transgenderism. What does this wind up looking like in practice? So we're going to look at these sort of esoteric traditions and the actions, basically homosexual behavior, or essentially sodomy, is what we're going to be looking at. Again, is this something that is for children or squeamish people? No. Again, as I've told you, this is not something that you should spend a ton of time on. This is something you learn once. You don't need to go back to it over and over and over again. You just need to understand it, where it comes from, why they're doing it, and then move on. We're going to be touching on Aleister Crowley, so people that are familiar with him and some of the actions that he's taken. You should be aware that it's going to be of an adult nature. So just be mindful of that. And essentially what we're going to see is the fact that what he considers quote unquote unnatural forms of sexual activity are more powerful and potentially more useful than quote unquote traditional forms of sexual activity. And again, as someone who's clearly going to be familiar with esoteric traditions and explicitly referencing some of the belief systems that we've already talked about, he's going to draw on that stuff and form it into his own behavior. Now, we'll circle back around to contemporary stuff later once we've kind of revealed the main crux of the whole story here. We're just establishing that these belief systems do in fact manifest in actions in the real world that the overwhelming majority of people would not find.
Okay, which brings us to this book. Again, dark topics here that we're talking about, but now that we've sort of had that additional context of who this Aleister Crowley is, let's sort of look at this book, which is basically the connection between Western esoteric traditions and basically using quote-unquote sex as a form of quote-unquote magic. And what do we see in the introduction? Again, references to Crowley. The root idea is that any form of procreation other than normal is likely to produce results of a magical character. And he provides a citation for that. So what does he mean? He means that in order to generate magic, quote unquote magic, and get what you want, because we already said that he was using magic for financial gain and all these other sorts of things, that you need to do stuff other besides traditional heterosexual sex. As we will see, many practitioners would also turn to explicit non-reproductive, meaning the kind of sex that can't produce children, and by the standards of their surrounding society, morally deviant and socially transgressive acts such as homosexual intercourse, masturbation, sadomasochism, and bestiality as the most powerful means to unleash a supernatural source of power. So if you're wondering where all this gross ritual stuff about the occult comes from, I mean, this isn't the direct source of all of it. This is predated by a lot of other things. When you see this stuff, this is where a lot of these ideas emerge. You get more power by doing weirder stuff. Of course, we come to this guy. Now, this is going to be... I hate this guy. This is going to be a discussion for adults only, obviously, as I sort of forewarned at the very beginning. Some of this stuff is pretty gross. Anytime that you go in an in-depth discussion on this guy, some of this stuff is pretty gross. Keep that in mind. Here we go. Aleister Crowley, occultist, philosopher, magician, novelist, mountaineer, founded the religion of Thelema, identifying himself as a prophet entrusted with guiding humanity into the Aeon of Horus. In the early 20th century, widely published over the course of his life, rejected his parents' religion and faith of Western esotericism. So he has all this stuff about Hindu and Buddhist practices and looking at the Book of the Law and this Aeon of Horus. In 1912, he initiated a German-based Ordo Templi Orientis, rising to become the leader of its British branch, which reformulated in accordance with his Thelemite beliefs. Thelemite groups were established in Britain, Australia, and North America. He went in the First World War in the United States, where he took up painting and campaigned for the German war effort against Britain. He gained widespread notoriety during his lifetime, being a drug user, bisexual, and an individualist social critic. He has quite the history here. He was born in 1875. He has a variety of education, including an interest in Percy Bysshe Shelley. So for those that are familiar with him, intimate connections to a lot of the previous sexual revolutions there. A lot of influential clubs throughout his life. He met a chemist and discussed their common interest in alchemy. And they became, Baker introduced Crowley to George Cecil Jones, Baker's brother-in-law, member of the cult society known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He progressed through the lower orders, though he was unpopular because his bisexuality gave him a sort of poor opinion. He goes on to develop this Order of Thelema, using sort of Egyptian and Islamic mysticism that he sort of integrates into things. He takes on the number of the beast, 666, in Christian beliefs, and he refers to himself as such. He wrote down everything a voice supposedly told him in the form of the Book of the Law. He travels to China and went on some mountaineering expeditions, big game hunting, tried to spread his ideas. He was starting to run out of money from his inheritance. Crowley found another wealthy benefactor and basically exploited his paranoia. He started taking in students to train them in his occult and magical practices. Victor Newberg, whom Crowley met in 1907, became his sexual partner and closest disciple. Following year, Newberg stayed at Boleskine, where he and Crowley engaged in sadomasochism. He continued to write prolifically, and he was popular in horror stories. He tries to evoke these Enochian magical rituals, a sex ritual, and tries to perform a blood sacrifice to a demon. Crowley found that other people began to criticize him, and a lot of times once people figure out what he's up to, they start kicking him out of areas of high influence. He publishes the Book of Lies in 1912. Theodore Roos accused him of publishing secrets of his own occult order, the Ordo Templi Orientis. Convinced Roos that the similarities were coincidental and the two became friends. And Roos appointed Crowley as head of the OTO, the Mysteria Mystica Maxima, and in a ceremony in Berlin, adopted the magical name of Baphomet and was proclaimed X. Now, if you remember from the esoteric lecture on transgenderism, you know that Baphomet was the goat-headed entity, demon thing that has both male and female parts. Crowley set about advertising the MMM and rewriting many OTO rituals, which were largely based on Freemasonry. His incorporation of Thelemite elements proved controversial. Fascinated by the OTO's emphasis on sex magic, Crowley devised a magical working based on anal sex and incorporated it into the syllabus for those OTO members who had been initiated into the 11th degree. So he adds sodomy into the ritualistic practices. He acted as a producer for the Ragged Ragtime Girls, a group of female violinists. He subsequently performed in Moscow for 6 weeks, where he had a sadomasochistic relationship with the Hungarian Annie Ringler. He continued to write plays and poetry, including Hymn to Pan and The Gnostic Mass. Churton suggested that Crowley had traveled to Moscow on the order of British intelligence to spy on revolutionary elements in the city. Crowley and Newberg settled in the apartment in Paris, where the former was involved in the controversy surrounding Jacob Epstein's new monument to Oscar Wilde. Crowley and Newberg performed this Paris working, a period of intense ritual involving strong drug use, in which they invoked the gods of Mercury and Jupiter. So he moves on to the United States. Again, I'm kind of speeding through this here. Again, more sex magic. They're basically trying to bring about this great work. And of course, because of his heroin addiction and all these abnormal sexual practices, his health becomes increasingly poor. He goes on to Berlin and London. He meets Aldous Huxley and Alfred Adler. So you think about Aldous Huxley and his, Brave New World, which I touched on many lectures back, and this technocracy ideas. How is this weird guy so interconnected with all these famous, wealthy, and powerful people? He developed a relationship with Patricia Doherty, offered to bear his child. Named Randall Gare, Crowley nicknamed him Alistair Ataturk. He died in a car accident in 2002 at the age of 65. He continued to socialize with friends, holding curry parties. In 1936, he published his first book in 6 years, The Equinox of the Gods, which contained a facsimile of the Book of the Law. The work sold well, resulting in a second print run. He was now living largely off contributions supplied by the OTO's Agape Lodge in California, led by rocket scientist John Whiteside Jack Parsons. So for those that are not familiar, this is one of the guys that invented rockets. He was intrigued by the rise of Nazism, influenced by his friend Martha Kunzel, believed that Adolf Hitler might convert to Thelema. When the Nazis abolished the German OTO imprisoned Germer who fled to the U.S., Crowley then lambasted Hitler as a black magician. He writes this book of Thoth and magic about tears and etc., etc. Okay. So weird, gross guy. Beliefs and thought. Crowley's belief system was described as a religion, as both a new religious movement and a magico-religious doctrine, formed of esotericism and modern paganism. He said his life was to bring Oriental wisdom to Europe and restore paganism in a purer form. It's unclear what he meant. Crowley's thought was not always cohesive, obviously. He was a drug-addicted weirdo and was influenced by a variety of sources ranging from Hindu, Buddhism, scientific naturalism, Western esotericism, ceremonial magic, alchemy, astrology, Rosicrucianism, which we've already touched on in the previous lecture that has all these hermaphroditic deities in it, when the esoteric connections to transgenderism, Kabbalah, and tarot. He had learned from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He incorporated concepts and terminology from South Asia religious traditions like yoga and tantra. So, and that's the thing, is it gets tough to tell the origins of some of these ideas because they just incorporate whatever works for them grossly into their own ideology, whatever they can readopt and reconnect. So sexuality played an important role, which is obviously why we're talking about this weirdo. And magic, ideas about his magic and his practice of it, and has been described as central to Thelema. He outlined 3 forms of sex magic: autoerotic, homosexual, and heterosexual. And he argued that such acts could be used to focus the magician's will onto a specific goal, such as financial gain or personal creative success. He treated sex as a sacrament. Okay, gross. Warning here, this guy's gross. With the consumption of sexual fluids interpreted as the Eucharist. This is often manifested as cakes of light, a biscuit containing either menstrual fluid or a mixture of semen and vaginal fluids. Gnostic Mass is the central religious ceremony with Thelema. His theological beliefs are not clear, and so he kind of goes back and forth. He nevertheless used satanic imagery by describing himself as the beast and referring to the whore of Babylon in his work. Well, in later life, he sent anti-Christmas cards to his friends. He said Crowley was not a Satanist, if for no other reason than to not be identified as such. He's also accused of advocating for human sacrifice because in Book 4 he stated a male child of perfect in innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory victim, and he added that he had sacrificed about 150 every year. This was a tongue-in-cheek reference to ejaculation, something not realized by his critic. Okay, but how do we know that? And to the author of this Wikipedia article, how do you know that? And it's so silly to me. Opinions on race and gender, and they have this whole section on here. He exhibited a preference for women. He particularly liked exotic women. Crowley was able to attract bohemian women to be his lovers. He applied the term Scarlet Woman to various female lovers whom he believed played an important role. During homosexual acts, he usually played the passive role. An underlying theme in many of his writings is that spiritual enlightenment arises from transgressing social sexual norms. He advocated for complete sexual freedom. He said homosexual and bisexual people should not suppress their sexual orientation. He opposed abortion on moral grounds, interestingly. But here we get into, well, he was accused of blatant bigotry, spoiled scion of a wealthy Victorian family. He had racial and social prejudices, said to have insulted his close friend, Victor Benjamin Newberg, using anti-Semitic slurs. He praised their sublime poetry. He thought the Chinese might be superior spiritually to the English. And they go on this section about sexism. Okay, so this guy is making biscuits out of people's fluid and drinking blood in rituals and sodomizing people, and you're worried that he might be then your criticism of him is that he's sexist against women and he might be racist. That's what Wikipedia is going to highlight. It's like That's the least of our concerns, people. And he's also intimately connected to all these intelligence agencies, including British intelligence. So why is this weirdo meeting with all these famous and wealthy individuals? And we'll see here in popular culture, he's referenced by Dennis Wheatley in his novel. Diane Fortune used Crowley as a basis for characters in his books. He appears on the Beatles' album Sgt. Pepper. His motto, "Do What Thou Wilt," is on Led Zeppelin's album. And Jimmy Page bought Boleskine in 1971 as part of the band's film. David Bowie makes a fleeting reference to Crowley in his lyrics and may substantially paraphrase Crowley's poem. Ozzy Osbourne and Bob Daisley wrote a song titled Mr. Crowley. A prophetic quote about the coming of the new Aeon has been featured in an opening introduction of the video game Blood Omen. Crowley began to receive scholarly attention from academics in the late 1970s. So why do all these popular figures know who this weird guy is? And so you see his friend Newberg, middle-class Jewish family, commission agent based in Vienna, abandoned his family. He came to know Crowley. He was an agnostic, vegetarian mystic, Tolstoyan. So now that we have a little bit of more background on Crowley, let's return to the book where we left off. When you see in our current culture this influence of trying to emphasize, oh, it's better to do or cooler to do or more interesting, or all those people are so repressed or repressive, and they're literally trying to get you away from the type of sex that literally produces babies in every facet. If you think that there's not a connection here, I think that's a little bit naive. It is no accident that the rise of sexual magic went hand in hand with the new search for sexual freedom, feminism, and gay rights, as well as new forms of exploitation, pornography, sexual commodification that have emerged since the late 19th century. Why? Because you have more power the more individuals that you get to do this. So whenever people say, well, why do you care? It doesn't affect you. Their process literally involves trying to get as many people as possible to engage in this stuff. Now, once again, I'm not saying every homosexual person ever is constantly trying to uproot the facets of society. And I'm not saying that you're actually producing a magical effect by engaging in these abnormal sexual practices. But I am saying there's individuals as connected as Aleister Crowley was, who's connected to British intelligence, who's referenced in what was and may potentially still be one of the most popular bands of all time in the form of the Beatles on their album cover, and all these other people are influenced by him. He's meeting with Aldous Huxley, and decades of people saying this guy's a weirdo, and he's still getting doors open for him. Sex magic and modernity. The science of sexual magic is the key to development and the underlying secret of all Masonic symbols. Again, what did we see with Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma book? What did he reference? The hermaphroditic deity. And so we see with homosexuality and homosexual practices here, we're seeing this connection to the structure of Freemasonry. It is certain that the sexual question has become the most burning question of our time. Following Foucault, I would suggest that the new interest in sexual magic was closely tied to the rise of new sciences in America and Europe in sexuality, which were in turn tied to the spread of biopower, or the attempt to regulate society through the increased knowledge of sexual reproduction. It reflects a new interest in deviant and non-reproductive forms of sexuality, such as homosexuality, masturbation, bestiality, and other non-normative sexual practices that run counter to an efficient, productive capitalist society. Now, they're using quotes here. This author is actually pretty pro-homosexual, actually, when you look at some of the quotes in it. So he's just compiling sources. There's many areas where he says, the Catholics are evil and repressive for trying to suppress some homosexual behavior. Again, I'm not telling you need to be Catholic or anything like that. We're just trying to trace back some of these ideas. But again, what is this keeping in line with? All the sexologists that were developing the field of quote-unquote sexology which later comes to be problematic, obviously. And all of their work featured centrally in the development of the transsexual phenomenon. So we see a common lineage here of the scientific merging with the esoteric once again, just like Harry Benjamin literally referencing all those ancient cultures and religious practices associated with transsexualism or hermaphrodites. Deviant acts such as homosexual intercourse and masturbation would become the means to unleash awesome magical potency. I will suggest that Crowley found in sexual magic the most intense experience of transgression, the overstepping of conventional taboos as a means to unleash an ecstatic, liberating power, and thereby herald a dawn of a new era in human history. Weird. But despite their differences, I would argue all these authors explicitly link the liberation of sexuality with an ideal of social and political liberation. Randolph was not only a proponent of affectional alchemy, but was also a powerful spokesman for abolition and a vocal feminist. So the same people that want to, weirdly, the same people that want to engage in all these transgressive sexual behaviors, same people that want to uproot society, were also in favor of feminism and abolishing slavery. Crowley would take the fusion of East and West still further by making sex magic the supreme magical secret and the ultimate source of power. I will place him in light of the debate surrounding sexuality and above all deviant. So he puts deviant in quotes as though there's nothing wrong with some of this stuff, including he's referenced bestiality multiple times here in the late 19th and 20th century. Though through explicit acts of transgression, Crowley sought a radical form of liberation on all levels, sexual, social, and political alike. By transgressing the limits of the old dying world of Christian Europe, he believed he was a prophet of a new era based on the supreme power of the individual will. Remember, this guy is a drug-addicted, syphilitic philanderer that we're talking about. Do we want to go by the rituals he's trying to initiate? One of his contemporaries, Bogomils, was widely attacked as lascivious hypocrites who engaged in all manners of sexual vice and above all homosexuality. Indeed, our modern English slang bugger is derived from the Latin vulgaris used for the Bogomils who had become notorious for their alleged practice of sodomy. And so the Inquisition basically started bringing charges against some of these folks, and they said it was blasphemy against the church, and they were committing homosexual intercourse, and they were worshiping an idol of a demon called Baphomet. Now, it's funny because he's basically saying the church's grounds for this are all baseless, which who knows, because given the historicity of some things, it is hard to prove intent. But if Aleister Crowley, in his own words, and all these guys orbiting him are saying homosexuality has greater potentiality to achieve their ends, and we still see Baphomet imagery in all of these disciples, I don't understand why it's particularly unreasonable. And given that we already saw in the contemporary Wikipedia article, he's completely inverting the sacraments of the church. So he's taking, the concept of the wine and the bread being the body and blood of Christ and inverting them with sexual fluids and stuff like that. I mean, we already know he was doing stuff like this. So then we get to the Ordo Templi Orientis, foundation of a new Templar order. He calls himself the Great Beast, and a full-scale Gnostic Mass. In Crowley's case, a worship of Baphomet is part of his esoteric practice. And so there's all this discussion of witchcraft. And now, as an example, it's not like all of the abnormal practices only extended to homosexual behavior, because I do want to point this out to be a little, to be fair, there's plenty of weird stuff going around between non-homosexuals. Heterosexual rites could be used for a wide variety of magical purposes, ranging from the invocation of the god to the finding of a hidden treasure. For example, one might use sexual magic to magically empower a talisman by concentrating on one's intended goal at the moment of orgasm and then anointing the talisman with the semen. One infuses it with magical power, which then can be employed for a wide range of this worldly and otherworldly ends. Similarly, the power of controlled imagination and sexuality can be used to incarnate a God within one's own consciousness. So again, whenever you hear people say all this weird stuff about, finding the truth within yourself and looking within and all this kind of stuff, I always kind of push back against that. And the same thing with all this psychedelic use, and the answers are within inside you and stuff, instead of using a logical set of principles to come to conclusions. There's all sorts of goofy stuff you can come to ideas about just by entering into these abnormal, suggestible states, dissociative states even, by concentrating all of one's will on the deity at the moment of orgasm and blending their personalities into one. Again, I don't like these ideas because you're literally opening the door for somebody else or something else to take over your own consciousness. Why would you do that? Homoerotic rites also have been used as part of Odio practices from an early date. The lingam is for Rus, the most sacred symbol of creation, divine power, and the logos, as Peter Koenig observes. Rus regarded the semen as the key to magical power and viewed women as ultimately non-essential to magical practice. Rus would later claim the central secret of the OTO was in fact a sexual interpretation of the Holy Mass, which involved the union of a man with God through the consumption of semen, as allegedly taught by Jesus Christ. That's what these... If you've ever read the New Testament in any capacity, I don't think that's in there anywhere. So yeah. And Rus, this individual that we showed, the one that he was, making fun of and all that kind of stuff, he seems to have a greater increased emphasis on homosexual superiority than even Crowley does. And so Rus ultimately gets kicked out, and there's this, connection to Freemasonry. And so some of the Masons don't want to be associated with this. And there's this connection to Gnosticism and all these other sorts of things. Okay. But what we've established here is that there's all these bizarre religious occulted practices that believe that other forms of bizarre deviant sexual behavior are superior to heterosexual behavior and better at achieving those ends, and in some cases specifically engaging in different types of homosexual behavior. This connection dates back a long time.